Hello. Hello. So it is a smaller class today. So I've got both the uh, computer up in front of me and a couple people here in person, and about a couple dozen of you online. So yeah, it's good to see you. Thank you also so much for, well, I apologize for having to reschedule. Yesterday, I was visiting family this week and I got caught in a crazy layover situation, and was stuck in DC for a while. So I wasn't going to be able to make it back on time. So I appreciate those of you who could reschedule, and hopefully the video, for those of you who couldn't make it, is well appreciated. But because there are fewer of us this time, I'm just going to ask people to really lean into participating today. So thank you in advance. So I'm not like a tech wizard, but Saidi, so I just hit share screen, right? If I want to, cool. So share. All right, yes. Communist labor history in the United States. So first, that song that we started with, I don't know if anyone is familiar with that song, but that was a song written by Joe Hill, who was a big, admired during his day, and then martyred labor organizer in the late 1800s, and then in the IWW. And he was killed by the bosses for leading some really impressive and important labor unrest. And he, along with other members of the IWW, sort of famously wrote a lot of the American song canon that we still use and love today. And that song, Rebel Girl, was written in honor of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who herself was a labor giant. She was also involved in founding the IWW and IWW organizing. She helped found the ACLU, in response to the beginning of the first Red Scare. And she was just a really important and admired labor organizer. And then when she got older, she joined the Communist Party. And in the late 30s, she was actually kicked out of the ACLU, kicked off the board, in some anti-communist hysteria, even though she'd founded the organization. So I love that song. Those lyrics were updated a little bit by Hazel Dickens, who sang that version. She was born in West Virginia in a coal mining family, and sang a lot of songs about the worker and labor struggle. And she, as a young musician, got connected in with the Seeger family, who were traveling around recording different labor movement and workers' songs. And then she got brought into the lefty world as well. So all good people to look up if you're not familiar. But I think just sort of a good representation of left-wing and communist labor politics over a sort of 80 or so year period when you look at those three people combined. So today we are going to be discussing some Lenin, some William Z. Foster, and then looking at historical examples of just the trade union movement. I do, as I apologized last class for, saying there's going to be stuff left out. This is definitely true. In this period, there's a lot one could talk about when looking at just literal history over the last 200 years. And I sort of chose to start the timeline of this class with with the Civil War and Reconstruction. But even that, of course, is missing a lot of labor struggle before that. And then in terms of the readings, the suggested readings I assigned for this class, there was also a lot I had to leave out. You'll notice that I started with the 30s. But of course, leaving off from the last class, we talked about Reconstruction period till the 30s is like a big 50-year period of really important labor struggles. I definitely do suggest people, if they want to get more in-depth reading on those, the books that I pulled, the excerpts from all have, most of them have coverage of that period as well. And I'll talk about some of it today. But I'm also hoping in this class that there are a lot of moments where you all feel free to speak about this history, about things and ask questions even about things I don't bring up. So I'm going to try to go sort of chronologically once we get to talking about the history, so that'll make it easier for people to jump in. But first, the theory, the study. So theory and practice. So wait, Saidi, this is for some, oh, there we go. Okay. So is there someone that would like to read this quote? It's pulled from Hammer and Hoe, which is a great history book about communist labor movement in Alabama in the 30s, largely led by Black sharecroppers. And is there someone online or one of the couple people here in person that want to read?
Wasn't prepared.
Hold on one second. Let's just grab you the mic.
Oh,
No, thank you.
I wasn't prepared. All right. It was up on the screen before. I was going to read it off the screen. There we go. I wasn't prepared for characters like Lemon Johnson, a former member of the communist-led Sharecroppers Union. In December 1986, I visited Johnson at his home in rural Montgomery County. He told stories about the 1935 Cotton Pickers strike, Stalin's pledge to send troops to Mobile to help Black sharecroppers if things got out of hand. And the night, a well-armed group of women set out to avenge their comrades who had been beaten or killed during the strike. When I asked Mr. Johnson how the union succeeded in winning some of their demands, without the slightest hesitation, he reached into the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a dog-eared copy of V.I. Lenin's What Is to Be Done and a box of shotgun shells, set both firmly on the bed next to me and said, right there, theory and practice. That's how we did it, theory and practice.
Thank you.
Right on.
Yeah, I love that little poll quote. But yeah, theory and practice, that's what you always have to study and that's what you always have to do. And I think that encapsulates it really well. And communist trade unionists have studied what is to be done since it was written. And so that's why I wanted to include it. So we're going to be, so this is like his whole first paragraph is like a whole page. So we can, so one person can take this, we can divide it into half, but, I thought that this was a really good, I was studying this paragraph and sort of, as you can see, highlighting it and underlining it based on the discussion that we had last week, where we were looking at the relationship between spontaneity and structure, right? And there's this great line, there's spontaneity and spontaneity, that like little sentence in here that I think is good. So I thought it would be good to look at like what we mean by spontaneity and how Spontaneity doesn't mean that there isn't good, important action happening. It's just about, does that spontaneous gesture of workers' movement that remains uncaptured, like, will it on its own become further communist struggle? And also, like, will, without intervention, will purely economic workplace struggles, will that lead to further, what Lenin referred to at the time as social democratic struggles, because they were the Social Democratic Party, which is different than what people mean by social democratic today. So history gets very confusing this way. But at the time, they sort of referring to communist Bolshevist ideals. So yeah, does anyone online want to do some reading?
I can go.
Thank you.
Should I stop halfway and then pass it over to someone?
Yeah, and if no one wants to take it from you, then just pick it back up.
Okay, cool. In the previous chapter, we pointed out how universally absorbed the educated youth of Russia was in the theories of Marxism in the middle of the 90s. In the same period, the strikes that followed the famous St. Petersburg Industrial War of 1896 assumed a similar general character. Their spread over the whole of Russia clearly show the depth of the newly awakening popular movement. And if we are to speak of the quote-unquote spontaneous element, then of course it is this strike movement which, first and foremost, must be regarded as spontaneous. But there is spontaneity and spontaneity. Strikes occurred in Russia in the 70s and 60s, and even in the first half of the 19th century, and they were accompanied by the spontaneous destruction of machinery, etc. Compared with these revolts, the strikes of the 90s might even be described as conscious. To such an extent do they mark the progress with which the working class movement made in that period. This shows that even the quote-unquote spontaneous element, in essence, represents nothing more nor less than consciousness in an embryonic form. Even the primitive revolts express the awakening of consciousness to a certain extent. The workers were losing their age-long faith in the permanence of the system which oppressed them and began. I shall not say to understand, but to sense the necessity for collective resistance, definitely abandoning their slavish submission to the authorities. Could pass it. Cool, Alexia.
Thank you. But this was nevertheless more in the nature of outbursts of desperation and vengeance than of struggle. The strikes of the 90s revealed far greater flashes of consciousness. Definite demands were advanced. The strike was carefully timed. Known cases and instances in other places were discussed, etc. The revolts were simply the resistance of the oppressed, whereas the systematic strikes represented the class struggle in embryo, but only in embryo. Taken by themselves, these strikes were simply trade union struggles, not yet social democratic struggles. They marked the awakening antagonisms between workers and employers, but the workers were not and could not be conscious of the irreconcilable antagonism of their interests to the whole of the modern political and social system, i.e., theirs was not yet social democratic consciousness. In this sense, the strikes of the 90s, despite the enormous progress they represented as compared with quote-unquote revolts, remained purely a spontaneous movement.
Thank you. So yeah, what do people think of this so far? Does this make sense to people? Does it, for people who have, organizing experience and see themselves as communist, is it relatable? Are there things you're thinking of sort of in relation to what we were talking about last class? And if people don't have any thoughts yet, it's okay, we can move on. But I just want to I find this really interesting. So if you have thoughts, feel free to chime in. And oh, sorry, in the room, we just need the mic so they can hear you. No, thanks.
The spontaneous element seems to be like, I guess a part of any beginning in a movement and stuff like that. perhaps it's not even really to be forecast. It's something that's more so just like reactionary to conditions, like more tied into the collective unit than it is organizing per se. But that energy could be rechanneled and redirected and then organized into a strategic plan in terms of self-determination.
Yeah. Yeah, no, oh, smart sidey. We're just doing some technical figuring out in the room. But yeah, just rereading this in preparation for this week, it really did have me thinking about the conversation we were having last class in relation to spontaneity and organization in the 2020 uprisings, George Floyd uprisings, for example. And spontaneity and organization. I mean, these are dialectical. Everything's dialectical process, right? So it all interweaves, and we like to try to simplify these things. We should. Oh, Tahia.
Oh, don't mean to cut you off.
No, please. It's small discussion, so just jump.
Oh.
Just go in.
Yes, definitely thinking about 2020, thinking more about the counterinsurgency that we talked about last time. And also thinking about without an organized left and without like communist movement to kind of take that workers' economic struggle and like actually put a class struggle analysis to it. Like I'm seeing a lot of, obviously we're seeing so much unionizing happening in these like neoliberal media spaces and like tech and or like even on the shop floor with like Teamsters, etc. And then just thinking about like what happens after that. Like I'm like in so many ways, I guess I'm like glad that I guess kind of like a resurgence of a labor movement, resurgence of unionizing being hip and in now, because like obviously we want worker protections regardless of whether it's like a 100K making tech worker or someone on the shop floor. But like, how do you channel then that into like actually mass movement and like a principled class struggle? I guess it's us, like it's organizers, it's parties, etc. But yeah, what happens next?
Yes. What is to be done? Right, exactly. And this is sort of what Lenin is getting at, right? Is like there's all this trade union activity. It's very exciting. It's clearly even better defined. It's more strategic. People are more conscious of what they're doing rather than just lashing out in anger. But it's still not, trade union consciousness is not going to by itself lead to revolutionary consciousness. And, there was a comrade who was asking last week, who was pointing out what he saw as a contradiction between Marx saying that the working class can emancipate itself with the idea of a vanguard needing to educate the working class. And sometimes people are like, oh, isn't this sort of elitist of Lenin, or people pick up on this in Foster? Is this a sort of elitism? And it's really not meant to be a moral position. It really is just that scientific socialism, the principles of scientific socialism were arisen at through study. And a lot of that intervention happened, Lenin's tracking a literal history of who developed what ideology and how it spread. But also just the idea that even if you are working, once it gets to a point, like most communists are working class, right? Like, even though there are always these sort of petit bourgeois elements. So, but then those communists have to go explain communism, at least to some degree, to workers. It's sort of like any other science, if you really think of it as a scientific analysis, right? I mean, you can on your own around you witness objective principles of scientific reality. You can study some of them on your own and get some understanding, but then eventually you have to be taught physics. Eventually you have to be taught, especially the sort of beyond 101 stuff. And scientific socialism, or more accurately, dialectical materialism and historical materialism as scientific analyses, and as a way to intervene on history to change it. It's a scientific method, right? So that's what they're getting at, is that's why there has to be intervention, because it's a scientific reality and it's not meant to be elitist. Especially because it is a lot of times the working class intervening for other working class, the vanguard intervening to help teach these scientific principles to the workers who understand the, objective reality sort of inherently that they're experiencing. But yeah, so that's what that's getting at. But yeah, I don't know if someone wants to read these two quotes, but it's just getting at some of that, some of how, the consciousness doesn't happen spontaneously, and also how, as a communist, and actually the second quote, Lenin was criticizing a bunch of other people who were in the Social Democratic Party and who had this idea that if you just talk about economist issues, then they will arise to. So Lenin is just sort of excoriating some of his party comrades. And by this point in history, around the 1900s, the Second International, the Social Democratic parties, the communist parties, were really starting to butt heads and get schisms that would ultimately really schism in a decade later. But yeah, does anyone want to read some more Lenin before we move on to Foster? Anyone online? Oh, okay, great. In the room.
We have said that there could not have been social democratic consciousness among the workers. It would have to be brought to them from without. The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e. the conviction that it is necessary to combine in unions, fight the employers, and strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories elaborated by educated representatives of the propertied classes by intellectuals.
And then can you read the next bit as well?
Sure.
Thank you.
Revolutionary social democracy has always included the struggle for reforms as part of its activities, but it utilizes economic agitation for the purpose of presenting to the government not only demands for all sorts of measures, but also and primarily the demand that it cease to be an autocratic government. Moreover, it considers it its duty to present this demand to the government on the basis not of the economic struggle alone, but of all manifestations in general of public and political life. In a word, it subordinates the struggle for reforms as the part to the whole, to the revolutionary struggle for freedom and for socialism.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is just again, getting at the idea that you're trying to do both, right? You're fighting for the reforms of the basic needs of the people, but when you get caught up in just that, revolutionary consciousness won't build on its own. But if you're just doing sort of revolutionary agitation, but not focusing on the needs of the people, then it also doesn't move forward. And Foster gets at some of that. So organize the unorganized. So this pamphlet by Foster, so people know, was written in 1926. So this was in the period following the first Red Scare, sort of the left is very underground at this moment. And the unions have been beaten, but, there'd been some union gain, of course, with the IWW and, the late 1800s victories, but the unions had been sort of very severely beaten back during the first Red Scare. And you see a union density that's very similar to where we're at right now, below 10%, somewhere between 5 and 10%. And there's all these industries that are being further developed and automated and pushed forward with technology, where there's all these jobs rising and opening up, and they're mostly just there's just no unions attempting these shops at all. And Foster is leading a left-wing fight within the AFL for the TUEL. It's a left progressive sort of precursor to the CIO, sort of on the journey to get to the CIO. And he's writing a pamphlet to agitate and talk about the real importance to organize the unorganized masses. And he also really stresses in here the importance of, it's interesting. I think it's interesting about these things in relationship. Lenin's talking about without communists, pushing certain kind of consciousness, you won't have that consciousness. But Foster's also like, this is true. And without Leninists, Leninist, yeah, he was a Leninist, but without communists and Marxists like pushing for these real progressive agitation, you're not even going to be successful as, at growing a union and gaining ground to begin with. And I agree with Foster on that, addendum. So yes. Would someone like to read this page?
The question of organizing the many millions of unorganized workers is the most vital matter of now before the American labor movement. The future progress of the working class depends on the solution of this great problem. The organization of the unorganized is a life and death question for the labor movement. To bring the millions into unions is necessary not only for the protection of the unorganized workers and to further class ends in general, but also to safeguard the life of the existing organizations. Many of the trade unions are now under such heavy attacks from the employers that their very existence is threatened. These strikers can be solved favorably to the workers only by drawing to their support the great mass of the unorganized.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. Sorry about that. I just realized I accidentally turned off my microphone. So I'm going to read the first half, and then if someone wants to pick up from me, and if not, I'll just keep reading. So the left wing must do the work. The organization of the unorganized millions of workers is primarily the task of the left wing. There is no other section of the labor movement possessing the necessary courage, energy, and understanding to carry through this basic work. The three general groups in the trade union movement play essentially the following roles in the gigantic task of organizing the unorganized masses. The left wing militantly leads, the progressives mildly support, and the right wing opposes. The essential form of an organizing committee or movement under present conditions in the American labor movement is a united front between the left wing and the progressives. with the left wing functioning as the driving force. The question of organizing the unorganized becomes daily more pressing. The TUEL and the left wing generally have a central part to play in the great developing movement of organization. This part we can play effectively if we will bear in mind the few general principles of organization elaborated above, namely, that the left wing must lead in and do the burden of the organization work, that we must avoid isolation from the unorganized masses and be prepared to utilize every form of proletarian organization in the quote unquote closed industries to further the establishment of unions. Does anyone want to finish reading this?
Sure, I can.
Thanks.
Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
We must study carefully the state of the industry and the condition of the employers and the workers' forces. Base our organization campaigns upon the economic demands of the workers, and at all times keep the fight focused on these demands. Plan our organization campaigns carefully and thoroughly mobilize all our forces to put them into execution. Extend our scope of activity over the greatest possible extent of workers, strike the blow at the opportune time, demoralize the enemy, rouse public sentiment to our maneuvers, develop the utmost fighting spirit in our own ranks by our invigorating propaganda, and follow up our victories to the limit by organizing all the workers shaken into action by our strikes and struggles. The left wing must take the lead in the organization of the unorganized millions. This is an historic necessity of the situation. We must not falter or fail at our task. It is a time for intelligent, courageous, militant action.
Thank you. Yeah, this whole pamphlet is a really good one. Some of us, when we were organizing the ALU Union Drive, some of the organizing committee read from it, studied it, gave it to other workers, suggested it that they read it. And this was actually also something that a lot of the Starbucks organizers read as well. It's just kind of, it really is striking when you read this pamphlet. I don't know if folks felt this when reading it before class, but it really is striking how this pamphlet is from 100 years ago, but it's so fresh and relevant today. So, yeah, I don't know. Also, I'm going to sit. I hope people don't. I hope that's okay. I don't know if other folks had thoughts that they wanted to bring up on the Foster. Raise your hand if you do, or just jump in, because we'll move on soon. We'll move on from it to just talk some history, But I think it's sort of funny how a lot of the major communist writers, I have a comrade who jokes that you read Lenin and it's all just like him talking about how meeting minutes are taken badly and how you need to it's just sort of like these instruction manuals, and that's true with Mao, that's true with Foster, that's true with a lot of these communist leaders throughout history. It's really just like organizing, like straight up organizing guides of like, this is how you do it, because they're materialists and they're trying to get other people to help, do a thing that cannot be done by just one person. So yeah, did anyone have thoughts on the Foster? And we can also come back to this because I think, yeah, we can come back to this at the end, but there's going to be, I think, ample time for discussion. So. No? Okay, well, that's fine. So yeah, and practice, theory and practice. So yeah, these are just some of the main sources that I think are good to sort of get a good understanding of American left-wing and communist history. I drew a lot from these books in designing these class. And like I said, most of these books if you haven't read, I can help get you a copy for free, because I think they're all worth reading and studying. Some of them have come out more recently and they get a lot of, the Organized Fight Win, that came out this year, and the People's Forum has done a lot to help promote that one. That's a really great one, looking at the Black women's working women's movement of the 30s, 40s, like Popular Front period. Fight Like Hell, that's a book by Kim Kelly of Teen Vogue fame, but she's a great labor journalist, and that came out last year, and that is looking at a lot of the contributions to labor by people of color, women, queer folks, etc. Which actually, that's, if you know American labor history, that won't surprise you at all. But it's, because that's who we have. But yeah, these are just recommendations. So the rest of I do want to apologize. The rest of the class, I don't really have slides for. I have one more slide, and then I wanted to put together pictures for the history section, but I ran out of time, so I hope you'll forgive me. Yeah, it'll just be nice discussion. So first let's see, how do I can click stop share, and that'll bring it back to like the multi-view. Cool. Great. And then everyone should be able to, how do I can change the view, right? I can change the view to be gallery.
There's 28 pages on the downloadable.
Yes. Yeah.
Are we going through those?
Yes, we're going through, the class is not over, just to be clear. I just don't have really any more slides. So it's just, but yeah, we're gonna go through that history. I just wanted to be able to see people's screens. Can folks just do me a favor? I just want to get a sense. Can you raise your hand if you were able to do this reading? Either with the little hand raisey button, or
If we're able to do what?
if you were able to do the reading in advance. It's okay if not. I just want to get a sense of where folks are at. I mean, I did it. I don't think I wrote a lot of it. It's okay. That happens to me too. Okay, cool. So it's like about a fourth of folks are able to get to the reading, and that's good to know. But yeah, I'm just gonna tell you then what the readings were about to entice you to read it, because it's some good stuff. So what I pulled from for these readings, basically I wanted to show a series of vignettes, sort of about how the Communist Party has been involved in worker struggle and in labor struggle over the last 100 years. And I think that these vignettes help get at some of that. So I'll just go through that, and then I'll jump back in time again and but if you have any questions, interrupt me and ask, and feel free to, yeah. Well, first I start off with the briefest of sections from Labor's Untold Story, which is just sort of it's a great book. It's just sort of to suggest to you to read the book almost, because it's basically just a few paragraphs talking about sort of the greatness of the American labor movement, and name dropping, Lucy Parsons and Eugene Debs, and sort of these sort of major figures. And it's a really good book for that 50-year period that I didn't assign any readings of, from sort of following the slave revolts, the biggest worker strike in U.S. history of the Civil War, through the book came out. Labor's Untold Story came out in 1954. So everything up to that point. But then sort of starting with A People's Art History of the United States, which is a really cool book for looking at if you want to dig into the struggle of artists as workers and revolutionary artists movements and communist artists. I definitely recommend looking at the workers' struggle and the communist movement through that lens of just studying sort of the great American artists. Paul Robeson to Tupac Shakur, right? There's this really, beautiful way that some of our greatest artists have been part of the militant workers' struggle and the revolutionary struggle. And just the way that we know that, great leaders like MLK, like their radical nature is removed from history. This is true with the artists as well. And, the artists organized section just really gets at the way that militant artists in the 30s organized themselves into a union and were able to demand during this upsurge of, really militant worker power in the country, in response to the Great Depression, the Communist Party was able to capture this energy and help people organize themselves into collectives and unions, including unemployment unions, and just force the government to do stuff. I mean, FDR, before he ran, wasn't saying like very social democratic stuff. If you go back and look at his speeches, right? But he was, by the worker power at the time, forced to fight for these workers' reforms. And and artists were a huge part of that. And some of the most famous programs that came out of the New Deal reforms, like the Federal Artists Project and the Federal Theaters Project and the Federal Writers Project, those federal entities, they were huge, and they produced some really amazing theater and art that we still admire today. And it's really interesting to study that period and see how influential artists were in the sort of forwarding of the workers' movement and building of Hollywood, and in so many ways. And so I wanted to get at some of that. And then also the included a really lovely little section from Fight Like Hell about called No Red Baiting, No Race Baiting, and No Queen Baiting. Of course, the LGBT movement was not as accepted by as a wide swath of the population as it is today. And of course, there were communists who were unfortunately reactionary in their opinion on gay and lesbian and gender, challenging people who challenging gender norms. But there were a lot that were very, advanced, progressive in the struggle. And especially you see in the maritime unions, there was a really vibrant gay culture, and especially the communist run unions of the time, defended their gay workers in a way that I think is a story you don't normally think about associated with the Communist Party of the past. And I think it is really important to sort of look at these progressive elements that did exist and were fighting, and we're sort of, again, always sort of in that struggle combined. There's a great piece included by Claudia Jones. Claudia Jones was an immigrant from the West Indies. She was a Black working class woman, huge leader in the Communist Party. And she was a journalist, and she struggled for, she struggled against white chauvinism within the party and to advance Black rights within the party. But she also struggled as a labor organizer to organize domestic workers. And, she is challenging the labor at the time to actually do this, because as you see today, even, right, like, unfortunately, big labor does not think about domestic labor as part of the labor movement. And this was a problem then. It's still a problem now. There's been some advance, of course, but and these are fields that are, then it was Black immigrant workers. It's the same today, right? Sort of continuation of subjugation. So this is just a great pamphlet on this, and this is all the 30s and 40s. Although actually, wait, this was the late 40s. Actually, the end of neglect and problems, Negro women's late 40s. There's a snippet that's towards the end, because I couldn't find a PDF of it and just had to scan it, but of some really great stuff. The Black history, apologies, so book title's a mouthful, so I'm sorry, I always forget it. But the Organized Labor and the Black Worker, great book by Foner, but a section on the Cold War and sort of the post-World War II, there explores the real contradictions between, the white communist movement and Black labor and Black communists, and sort of the various disagreements, but even how amongst that they were still trying to organize under the communist banner. But then the Cold War and McCarthyism start, and big labor is taken away from the left, taken over by reactionary center-right forces and right-wing forces. And, this period of this 20-year period of labor really focusing on Black workers and focusing on organizing Black workers is just sort of crushed. And that's very depressing. And then I included a reading on the Fort Hood 3, which, at the end of last class, there was a comrade who asked about, how could we possibly foresee like having military might if this is a necessary component to securing revolution? You need actual enforcement on your side. This is true, but how do you see that? And I brought up the examples of in history where soldiers as workers organize as workers and refuse to fight in this way. And that's, it can be a way to end war or secure revolutionary scenarios, et cetera. And the Fort Hood 3 is a really important thing to know about. It was the beginning, the first instance of the soldier strikes during the American war on Vietnam. So the Fort Hood 3 were the first 3 GIs to refuse to go fight in Vietnam. And 2 out of 3 of them were communists. They were in the Young Communist League. And they were arrested for this, right? And within a few years, there was a mass movement of soldiers refusing. And, this article also gets at the divisions within the labor movement, how some of the labor movement at the time, it's like there's this popular memory of the labor movement being pro-war, but there were obviously that's not true. There were sections of it that weren't. So, I think this is a really important thing to think about, especially because a lot of tellings of histories talk about the left sort of ending in the communist movement, especially communist labor movement ending in the 50s, because it was being crushed by McCarthyism. But some of these readings that I included, I wanted to show that this wasn't true. The Cold War and McCarthyism and Red Scare #2 were crushing in many ways, drove people underground, threw people in jail, people died, both from execution and suicide. It was a very tragic period, but it did not end the communist movement, especially in terms of the peace movement. That was particularly true. I have a section from Let Them Tremble, which is a great book looking at Communist Party history over its first 100 years. It has a lot of history of that sort of, again, post-50s stuff. I included a section on Judith LeBlanc, she's an indigenous organizer. And communists, even when they're not within the labor movement, are sort of always looking to connect the labor movement to the other worker struggles, to democratic struggles, to anti-racist struggles. So this is a piece that's getting at the way that she fought as an indigenous woman to have indigenous rights be taken seriously. And again, looking at Lenin, it's like there was this white chauvinism that made it so that white workers weren't taking, they just wanted to focus on economist issues. They just wanted to focus on quote unquote, worker issues within a union. And she's like, no, you have to also look at the native struggle. You have to try to bring all these things together if you're being revolutionary and if you're being communist. And then I also had a quick little article on the 2005 MTA strike, just because I don't think a lot of people know that, the Communist Party was involved in that, along with, many other left movements, but it's just that history is there. So I just wanted to, encourage you guys to read those if you haven't done the reading yet. It's just very interesting. And now I'm just going to jump back in time and I'm going to keep talking. But also I do want to say again, if people have thoughts and want to interrupt me as I talk, please just jump in, because I always feel I'm a big history nerd, so I know this stuff really well, and I try to apply to my daily life. But like I said, we're all learning together, right? We're all studying this together, and we're all trying to apply it together. So I don't really consider myself to, know that much more than any of you guys. So, but yeah, did people who did the readings, any of the 4 or 5 who did the readings, did you have things you wanted to mention about them that stuck out to you that you really appreciated, or that you had questions on, or that just you drew lessons from? Not to put those 4 or 5 people on the spot, but
Definitely taking with me. I'm organizing tenants right now in Queens. I'm with an organization called CAV. So we're organizing working class Bengali and Asian immigrants in a highly quickly getting gentrified neighborhood. And yeah, the stakes are very high. The buildings are in extremely bad shape. And so I'm trying to take a lot of these struggles and carry the lessons over to the structure of organizing buildings. But yeah, the key sticking out with me is meeting material needs as you're organizing workers, and in our case, tenants. And so we're building the space, and it's a very fresh chapter. And it's a community of folks who haven't been organized in this way before. And they haven't had gas for 10 months, this particular building. And so it's kind of, obviously the first form of justice that they seek is legal help or direct services. And so it's really shifting that narrative, shifting that mindset, but also then using the legal help as like a material needs meeting tool to get to organizing them. So I'm just thinking a lot about that.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about, oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just so were you, as you were reading the Foster, like, was that sort of, how did you find that applying to because it's a different sort of model, obviously, the labor unions versus the tenants unions. So I'd be interested if that was applicable at all.
Yeah, it's thinking a lot about the unorganized and that it is like our duty and responsibility. And thinking a little bit more about like the difficulties of when you're, we're not organizing them towards a specific demand. Like, yes, this is one campaign for this particular building that hasn't had gas, but like it's a larger question about things that will come, gentrification to come, fighting rent to come, etc. So yeah, when the structure is so amorphous, and you're organizing folks towards like not like a very specific aim, it's a little bit just like the difficulties of that. So thinking about that. Yeah.
Thank
I don't
you.
know. Yeah, if anyone else is also like applying it to folks who are organizing right now.
I can jump in and say something real quick if that's okay.
Sure.
Hello, class. Yeah, I am starting to try to organize my workplace. I feel like it's just so interesting how we all have these different, reasons we're trying to organize, really. And everything is really dire right now, right? The economy is pretty hard. Everybody's struggling. But right, there's buildings, right, that aren't being taken care of properly. But there's also my situation where I think a lot of the people within the organization right now don't feel like it's that big of a deal, right? So not only are they unorganized, they almost feel like there's not really a reason to, because maybe the comparison, like, at least I have a job, right? At least this and that. So that would be an interesting thing. And actually, like I said, I haven't gotten the chance to get through all the reading, especially the Foster. I started it, but didn't quite get to finish it. But now I really want to dig into it and see if there's something in there about how are we talking to people who really maybe perceive it as not the necessary thing, but in the long term, it really does seem like this is one of the only things that's going to allow us to have any power in the face of continuing authoritarianism to grow in the workplace. Or it seemed to take a big hit during the pandemic. We had more freedom from working from home from this in our company. But now they're trying to reel it back in. So it's just an interesting way of thinking about, it's interesting reaction. Like sometimes it's like, well, isn't it obviously bad? Why isn't everybody just jumping on board? So trying to figure out how to, and I think that's where it is beneficial to try to put it into a larger conversation, right? It's not just your workplace. It's about, well, what if the leadership changes, right? So it's not just in our department, it's completely on scale with the company or in a larger political sense too. So yeah, I just wanted to share that. I think it's really interesting.
Thank you. And right, it's like without a contract, the policies could change on a dime, right? So yeah, and unfortunately, sometimes it's hard. That's why it takes, like you've seen, unfortunately, in the tech sector, right? Like you've seen tech workers really start to, gain consciousness, at least trade union consciousness, because of that. But I think, it is interesting, in it being in a period where there's been such economic disruption, and the last few years have been so hard on people. I think you can also latch on to people's recognition of that. It's like sort of, I was saying how people objectively observe phenomena like you're going to observe the phenomena of a scientific reality, even if you won't understand the whole thing. So people see these realities in their everyday lives, and sort of in conversations you can find ways to, get into that. And next week's class is going to be sort of on, Union Organizing 101, breaking down more of this stuff into, I'm sure a lot of it'll feel familiar and seem familiar, but it'll maybe help give more concrete things to think about for those of you that are working to organize your workplaces. So yeah, so if no one else has more thoughts, I'm just gonna keep going, but please, like I said, feel free to interrupt me.
Can I add
Go,
one quick
absolutely,
thought?
please go
Appreciate it.
ahead. Thank you.
Just like to build up on Jarad, I hope I'm pronouncing your perfect. Yeah, and I apologize that I've not done the reading, so that's to preface my comments. But from my very practical experience organizing in a work environment where we had it pretty good, and then we did not have it good anymore, I found that my personal experience is that it's always going to be extremely hard to convince people to move people to action when there's not a specific issue that they're going to try to tackle. Like convincing people to put their livelihood on the line, take risks, and take some of their bandwidth to work towards some ideological goal is going to work with activists, in my experience at least. I think it's going to be extremely difficult to get people to do that, spontaneously, unless you show them what a win looks like. Where at that point, I think maybe there's some room for getting people to take initiative, but otherwise, I think it's always going to be really hard. But in my experience of working at a place where working conditions have really declined significantly over the past few months, I find that it's equally as hard to move people to action, even to solve specific issues. And one of my mentors, labor organizer, gave me a really good piece of advice, which was people will find so many different excuses for not organizing, and they will frame them in many different ways. But that's it's kind of it's fear bundle in many different ways, right? And so like an abstract idea does not enable you to overcome that. What enables you to overcome that is identifying the one very specific issue that matters to them very directly. And so if they can see that they can win on that one thing, that's usually where personally I'm able to make the most out of the situation. But it is challenging, and I find it as challenging when things are going well as when they're not going well. It's pretty interesting.
Thank you. Ian? Is that your name? Thank you, Ian. Yeah, absolutely. Right. It definitely, this is why, small scale material wins, wins, or at least identifying what people wants, even before wins, is so necessary. And Foster does talk about that. It's one of his themes across his writing, sort of the way you have to, do this, combining like being a leftist with, identifying people's needs. And yet one-on-ones, having one-on-one conversations with people just to learn what is the thing that they really need. And yeah. And it feels like, a lot of times it is a slog, which is also what Foster is getting at when he says the left have to do the work. The left have to take up, the left are often the ones with the courage and fortitude, because what drives us is this larger vision, and the larger vision helps you stick through doing sort of boring spreadsheet work that you have to do to keep, you know what I mean? Like you have to do this foundational stuff and be meticulously tracking things, right? And sometimes you can find ways to enjoy it, but a lot of times it's just work. It's just work. But it's our greater vision that helps push us to keep going, through that stuff that isn't always so exciting, but that adds up to leading to the exciting things, right? Okay, cool. So again, feel free to interrupt at any time. I'm just gonna, I talked a little bit about those readings, but I just want to go back in time and just sort of talk through history, and highlight just how the left was involved throughout this history. And for some of you, this might be just review and thinking through stuff. But yeah, so where we last left off, last class, we were talking about the end of the Reconstruction, right? The troops were pulled out, and there was a counterterror by white reactionaries and the Ku Klux Klan, and that revolution was killed. But and then following that, as sort of part of that crushing of it, you have the beginning of a period of, tenant leasing, convict leasing, people being arrested on petty crimes and leased out for labor, poor white folks, but of course, mostly Black people, sort of the beginning of a disproportionate targeting for crimes and criminality, in the beginning of sort of the very beginning echoes of our prison industrial complex. But there was, as Frank Chapman talks about in the Marxist-Leninist perspectives, that there is, led by communists, a real progressive integrationist labor movement. And this continued to be true for a while over the next, period of the end of the 1800s. But unfortunately, over time, you also have, you have the sort of white chauvinist elements or straight up racist elements of labor, unfortunately. But then you also have the communists that are much more progressive. Unfortunately, over time, some of those communists, it's sort of successive generations among some of the communist movement, among what became the social democratic movement, that progressive nature sort of is subjugated and brought lower than the economic and economist reforms. And this is true globally. You see this sort of degradation. And that's who Lenin is yelling at in what is to be done, the sort of degradation of the social democratic, communist conviction for a sort of economist approach of people calling themselves communists or social democrats or revolutionaries, but they're really just, not doing that, not following the ideals. But yeah, and you do have some that sort of some of the segment of the social democratic communist, Marxist strain that keep progressive and are pushing for integration. And then you also have the beginnings of, sort of different Black freedom movements, sort of Black nationalist strains, more liberal Black strains, and, also sort of Black integrated strains of labor as well. But they're all also just Black workers that come together to form Black associations, brotherhoods, and trade unions as well. And you have the formation of the Socialist Party during this time. You have people like Eugene Debs, Big Bill Haywood, leading these massive rail strikes, all over the country. Those were some of the, in this sort of like pre-IWW formation, the formation of people who would go on to form the IWW. And then you also are having some really militant, workers' uprisings continue. I'm just going to share screen for one more slide. So let's see. Because you have things like the Homestead strike. So the Homestead strike, which was in 1892, and in Pennsylvania, Homestead, Pennsylvania. This was steel workers against the Carnegie barons, the famous Carnegie family. And they got together and they were leading a little revolt and they were taking over the town, and they had it, for like about a week. The National Guard had to be called in and crushed it, and a number of people died. But you have a lot of instances of this in the late 1800s and early 1900s of a real sort of classic militant, good old boy, especially in the South, workers' militancy of workers, grabbing guns and fighting back. Whether you're talking in sort of the West Virginia and the coal region, or you're talking about the cowboys out west, that's a fun classic American example that, the telling of history perverts. But for those of you that don't know, the cowboys were actually mostly Black laborers, sort of standing up to the cattle barons, right? So you actually like that. And that history is definitely not told that way, but that's actually the cowboy is, part of Black history and Black worker history that I don't really have a slide on. But there's all sorts of fun, very real rough and tumble militant worker things for this period. I think this is a really fun, the Homestead strike, just sort of fun in a way of an example of how the left was involved in it. You had the the reactionary and the political class at the time commenting on the workers being communists and saying that they thought that they believed that the profits were actually theirs. So you have this very real fight that's going on for a long time. So you have similar revolts that, the same kind of revolts that you were seeing all over Europe in the 1800s. Like you saw those, and not just in the enslaved worker situation, but sort of all over the place. So yeah, I just wanted to give people a chance to look at this cartoon, read it. It's by a cartoonist, Fred Wright, who he wrote and drew during the Popular Front period. He was then a cartoonist with the National Maritime Union and did propaganda during World War II against fascism. He was able to stay employed during the McCarthyist period because he got a job with UE, which UE was one of the few unions that split from the AFL-CIO and kept, they refused to sign a loyalty pledge. They kept their lefty members. They weren't as strong as they once were, but they were one of the few, communist started, left-led unions that stayed left, and they're still good to today. The other one is the ILWU, the longshoremen, the Western longshoremen. They were also another one that escaped the worst of the Red Scare union wise and still have a fair amount of a lefty bent to them. But yeah, I just wanted to share that cartoon. So, but yeah, let me then just exit screen sharing again. How do I do that? Stop share. Okay. Thank you. So, you had that going on. You had things like the, Haymarket, which is actually a little bit before that thing. Sorry, all of this stuff was, of course, it was all, it was different regions, but it was all influencing each other, just like today, how, we're all reading the news and paying attention to the militant struggle happening all over the country, all over the world. That was true then, and everyone was inspiring each other. And it's always important to remember that.
Like the housing crisis is tied to like the Palestinian liberation and everything like that. You know what I mean? Like the U.S.
Yeah.
housing crisis.
Yeah, the comrade in the room was just talking about how housing, organizers and the struggle for housing, how there's real interaction with the Palestinian liberation movement, and you see that with all the movements, and that was true then, that's true now. So, but yeah, you had Haymarket in 1886, the Haymarket Affair. Does anyone not know? Does anyone not know about Haymarket? Just raise your hand if you've never heard of it and you don't know what it is.
It sounds familiar, but I don't know.
Okay. Does someone else who has, because I've been talking a lot, does someone else want to summarize what the Haymarket Affair was? If not, I'll give it my go, but. The reason for May Day, exactly. Yeah, no. So the Haymarket Affair. There was a workers' revolt in Chicago, and there were a lot of anarcho-syndicalists involved, and there was an explosion, and some police died. And it's sort of debated whether, just like today, it's like, was the bomb thrown by just someone trying, an anarchist, feeling it was justified, or was it likely an op by the powers that be? Because after the Haymarket Affair, 4 of the organizers were held responsible. They were sort of really important left-wing organizers at the time, and they, including Lucy Parsons' husband, and they were hanged, and they were martyred. And then in their honor, there sort of began to be the recognitions of May Day, May 1st, as an international workers' holiday. And you started to begin to see May Day being celebrated on local levels, by the early 1890s. And that's actually when you started to get some US officials pushing for us to have a Labor Day. In the 1890s, you started seeing US officials push for us to have a Labor Day in September, because they saw that the workers' movements were pushing to have a Labor Day May 1st, and they wanted to create divisions so that there wasn't like this big international connection. So, but yeah, reason for May Day, international holiday, came out of the US. We have a couple of those actually, where the US inspires international revolution around the world holidays, but yet a lot of US workers aren't necessarily familiar. It is our job to teach everyone we know about May Day, because a lot of people don't even know about it. But yeah, you see it is socialists, and more importantly socialist women, that actually coin May Day. And then later they do the same with sort of International Working Women's Day, where seeing in the early 1900s, a lot of working women were revolting and striking. There were a number of strikes in 1908 that ended up by women workers, a lot of the textile industries especially, and this sort of was propelled forward into a celebration and remembrance of this. The IWW officially came into being in the early 1900s, and leading a lot of these strikes. 1911, you have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. which is when, for those of you who don't know, there was a textile factory in Lower Manhattan. There was a fire. The bosses had locked everyone in the building to prevent people from leaving, so they would be more productive. So, yeah, hundreds of, people burned to death. People climbed to the top, and this was like an 8-story building. There weren't a lot of buildings that tall at the time, so fire truck ladders weren't even tall enough to get to the top. So people jumped to their death rather than burning to death. And yeah, this was a huge, it led to congressional hearing. There were a number of things happening at the time that led to sort of congressional hearings of this and adding in certain safety code and labor laws. But this especially ignited a working women's movement to, take to the streets and continue unionizing. Then you have the Bread and Roses strike at the time as well. So the Northeast especially was becoming really militant in the workers' movements. But then you also have happening at the same time of that period, you have the coal wars going on. So all over the Appalachian regions, and also, the Southwest, you have the Ludlow Massacre, where, all of these big revolts where, in order to stop the workers who were armed, who had armed themselves in sort of this revolutionary spirit of the American Revolution of like, it's like we are going to arm ourselves and in a very classic communist way, like take what is ours. But this was crushed by the National Guard and, time and time again, in the coal wars in West Virginia, which was a period of about a decade where there were various revolts that were workers in these coal towns rising up with guns, being stopped with force by the police or military. You also have the culmination of the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is, perhaps one of the most famous examples in 1921. And the U.S. Military forces dropped bombs on, no, that was another. There were other massacres where the U.S. has dropped bombs on its own citizens, but the first instance was the Blair Mountain example. And so during this period, of course, there's also all kinds of stuff going on the international stage. You have World War I starting, right? You see resistance to this all over the world. You have the social democratic parties, as I'd mentioned, the Second International starting to really split apart ideologically. So by this part, there wasn't just the sort of more left-wing progressive Bolshevist group that took an anti-chauvinist, turn as important and sort of were pushing back against economistic thinking. You also had that side opposing the other side, which there was a side of the social democratic parties that supported World War I, and they supported their countries going to war and fighting other countries. And the Bolsheviks, the communist movement, were saying no. They were calling for workers and soldiers to go back home and turn their guns against the kings or the bourgeois leaders, because the idea is that there were these imperialist powers fighting, and what were you fighting them for? And then you have the peace movement in the US, where you have people being arrested, right? Like people being arrested for saying you should not fight in the war. Free speech was not a guarantee at the time. Actually, at the time, none none of the constitutional rights were affected on a state level. Like it actually took the development of the ACLU and sort of certain legal arguments led by the left, making very creative usage of the tools of the court to ensure certain rights. And you also have at this time the first Red Scare, a big attack on immigrants, because a lot of the communists and the communist movement came from immigrants from Europe. So a lot of the, so there was a big pushback against having these immigrants here. So there was a huge anti-immigrant hysteria. A lot of people went to jail. A lot of people were deported, and the communist movement was forced underground. And then also at this time, a lot going on. Also at this time, you have the Russian Revolution, right? So at the end of World War I, the Bolsheviks were like, you know what, you're right, Lenin, we should stop shooting each other. We should shoot, we should maybe turn the guns on the kings, right? And with the Russian Revolution, in particular with the October Revolution, this further split the socialist parties around the world. So you had literal fistfights on the street of New York of people arguing like, we support the Bolsheviks or we don't. You had these huge fights going on that are kind of unimaginable now. Imaginable in some ways, but it's like all of this was going on. The Socialist Party was split, the IWW was split, everyone was sort of not sure what to do. Out of this came two communist parties in the United States during the 1920s that eventually merged. So in the late 1920s, during a Comintern meeting, the Comintern said to the two American parties, you can't fight, you have to get together and become one party. And also you have to focus. They listened to the Black comrades that had come, the Black American comrades, and they're like, you have to focus on integration, you have to focus on Black struggle. And this is then what sort of helped propel and set up the communists to really become leaders in this way in the 1930s. Sort of very famously, the communists focus on the Black worker struggle in the South. But that was, that was a directive, an international directive from the USSR. It's like, no, to be a good communist, like this is what you do. And then, as I sort of got to the beginning class, the 1920s was a sort of bleak period labor-wise because of all of the suppression. But communists were still organizing, and they just were ready when the crash happened to start channeling that energy, sort of, because it's not like anyone saw. Yes, you knew a crash was going to happen, but it's not like anyone knew that the Great Depression was coming, right? So it's just sort of this spontaneous thing, this spontaneous anger, but just enough organization to then channel it. And then to build that into, you have the formation of the CIO in the 1930s, and this becomes the biggest labor vehicle, organized, mass labor vehicle in U.S. history. This is the period where, the sort of quote unquote popular front period of American communism develops. There's a lot of propaganda that's really pointed at saying like, no, being a communist is actually like the culmination of American ideals, like good Americans, to sort of try to press back against this claim of them Russian spies. And that's when you have all of this, you have all of these great sort of really famous, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger songs that sort of enter into the Americana songbook. And it's like the communist propagandists are so successful in this period that you have a lot of the cultural production that was created of the day is still very popular today among just the general masses, but people don't even know that it's communist. So they were a little too good at doing the secret thing. They were a little too good at it. Like they didn't quite do the thing where you let people know what you're actually doing. So, it's an interesting thing to learn from. But but yeah, they, communists, there are interesting contradictions in the 30s in the labor movement, as the Communist Party is trying to figure out how it's relating to the rising fascist situation in Germany. Of course, we all know the sort of complicated, situation with USSR doing a dance of trying to defend itself or attack Germany, and of course the American communists and the USSR were heavily involved in defending Spain from the fascists and fighting in the Spanish Civil War, while at the same time during that period saying like, no, we don't want to go to World War II. So you get these interesting contradictions arising. But then by the time, by the time it was clear that fascism really was expanding in a way that you had to go on the offensive. The communists, of course, were all in for fighting the fascists. And there was this interesting way where they were discouraging workplace action because they were saying, no, for the greater good of the Popular Front right now to defeat fascism, we have to make sure that production continues for wartime. So you get these interesting sort of developments. And then during this period, of course, there were elements of Black labor that really supported that, because there were elements of Black labor that were all in on going to war, but then there are elements of Black labor that were like, who cares about that war? It's like, we need to fight for, our people here. And so straddling, like, how do you straddle those contradictions? And then unfortunately, there's also a couple of other reactionary moves at the time by the party. Well, I don't know. I think the Popular Front was progressive. There were a couple things that happened during it, though, that were, wrong. Like the communists did not oppose internment camps, for example, and that was the wrong line. Very clearly, we all know that now. But still, even despite all these contradictions, you still have the Communist Party like leading the most progressive wings of labor. And then after World War II, as the sort of as the Foner section gets into, you have communists in the left really wanting to return to focusing on the Black struggle as the primary focus, but then you have big labor and reactionary labor crushing this, because you also have, after World War II, William Z. Foster takes over as the leader of the Communist Party, because the previous leader, Earl Browder, you all might have heard of him. He went crazy and decided to dissolve the Communist Party because he thought that he believed that some peace was going to be kept, some detente was going to be kept, and just so we didn't need the Communist Party anymore. It was bizarre, but everyone was like, no, kicked him out. William Z. Foster takes over. And then you have the biggest strike wave in US history in 46 and 47, outside of the Civil War, of course. That was bigger, but outside of that, biggest strike wave in US history, massive general strikes. And that's when you see the introduction of the Taft-Hartley Act, which is still in place today, which was, put a lot of restrictions on the labor movement. And, you started to see really the Red Scare come about. And people, you have HUAC, calling everyone in the Communist Party and even slightly associated with communism. Before it, you not only had the federal level, but the state levels. And it's really hard to overstate just how horrific this was, because, so just one example. So earlier I mentioned how the UE was a communist created CIO union, very radical left. They managed to, they refused to do the loyalty pledges. They, got out of the AFL-CIO in the 50s, but at their height in the 40s, like they had 600,000 members, just one union. So I want you to think about that. How many millions of people were connected into the communist movement? A lot of them weren't communists, but they were happy to work with communists. And they knew that the communists were the ones that were leading the left fight. And so everyone was drawn before the state versions of HUAC and HUAC, and they were forced either into silence to act like they never were part of this movement and moved into the suburbs. And, you know, I mean, that's how you have things like Lucille Ball, right? So she was a communist for a long time, and then during the 50s sort of retreated to a sort of like quiet life and pretended like that never happened. And it was like, oh no, it was just no, but she was like a leader in the LA, you know, and sort of the artist workers struggle out at the time. You have so many examples like this of people just basically forgetting that life. You have other examples of people who, you know, couldn't in order to survive, rescind that. So they were chased out of their jobs. They were chased out of towns. I mean, literally, like families that stayed communists at the time were chased out of towns by angry mobs. Every mob they moved, I mean, every town they moved to, it would come out that they were communists, and they would just chase out of town. They had to move along. And oh no, what just happened? Am I still there? Something just happened with this, but I think but it's okay. Okay. So, and it just like, I don't know why that just happened. Okay, thank you. You know, it was really tragic. A lot of people committed suicide during that period. You know, you even have big names like Pete Seeger, one of the biggest names ever. I mean, he couldn't get work for 10 years, right? He was brought, you know, it's like there were Johnny Cash helped get him his first like post whatever gig, like was like, no, you know, you have people like Paul Robeson, who his passport was taken from him, and he couldn't, you know, couldn't support the international workers' struggle. And, you know, these are like major examples of this, but this was over and over again. And these committees, these HUAC committees, these anti-communist committees were so reactionary. I mean, they would drag people before them. The kinds of questions people were asked would they be like, sir, does your wife read? I mean, literally, like the level, are they literate? Like the level of like supporting Black struggle, supporting women's rights, these were seen as communist struggles. So if you were in any way associated with any of those things, you were gone after. And, you know, that movement was crushed, and then that history was taken from us so that we don't even think of it, so that we can't apply it and use it. And, you know, this period of time was, of course, wrapped up in a huge anti-communist global project of coups, of killing millions of people around the world. Shout out to the Jakarta Method if you haven't read that book. It's a good book about the international anti-communist, you know, death machine of the United States at the time. And the anti-communist pushback in the US, while not as deadly, was wrapped up in that. You know, it was all part of it. So studying that international history is good if you haven't. But the communist movement did continue. You know, you of course had the New Left, but then you also had the communist movement, you know, that continued. There were ebbs and flows, but there was a rebuilding of the Young Workers' Liberation League, the YCL at the time, what it was called. You know, and a lot of these movements were you know, the YCL at the time was actively partnering with the Black revolutionary struggle, with the Black Panther Party. You know, you had communists active in peace societies and friendship societies, really the only ones, you know, pushing for friendship societies in Russia, because also with the developments of the left in the US, a lot of the new left, a lot of the revolutionary left of the 60s was on the China side of the Sino-Soviet split, which is also all very interesting politics that we can't get into, but we don't have time. But you know, it's like the communist left, the Communist Party left, were the only ones really fighting against reactionary things, you know, against Russia, and making these friendship societies between unions in the US and unions in Russia, and workers making solidarity trips to visit each other. So, you know, those connections are there. And then of course, you know, Angela Davis joins the Communist Party and leads a lot of good Black freedom struggle work, especially out in California under the Communist Party banner. And she, runs as vice president a number of times in the 80s. And and then the Soviet Union fell, and communist movements all over the world were pushed back. A lot of parties just ceased to exist. A lot of communist parties ceased to exist. The U.S. Held on, though. Like I said, we were involved in the early 2000s, not just the MTA strike, but the Communist Party and the PSL, because PSL came about in the early 2000s. The Communist Party and the PSL worked together and planned a lot of the major anti-Iraq war demonstrations were planned out of the building on 23rd Street, out of the Communist Party building. And then, unfortunately, there was some reactionary leadership in the Communist Party, and it shrank and sort of almost dissolved again, and is now rebounding. And of course, also so that's the communist thing. And then the general left, sort of the Obama movement, came in and kind of took the wind out of the sails and crushed that a little bit. And then you see, Occupy sort of give beginnings of a resurgence of the new life of the millennial left movement. And then we are today. But all along the way, like even in the periods of ebbs, the communist movement was still there in the labor movement, in the 5 for 15 movement, at Occupy. And now we're finally, Bernie allowed for this resurgence of socialism of various kinds in the US. And we're finally starting to see a resurgence of Marxism. But yeah, we have, we're basically coming to the end, but I don't know if I feel bad because I feel like I was just talking a lot more this time without much room for discussion. But I don't know if people have thoughts on any of that history. And
A found of information, though. That's definite.
Thank you. Yeah. Did anyone have any last thoughts before I wrap up? Hold on. Let's just the mic, talking to the mic.
A question in regards to like unionization in regards to farming and also tenants. The leftist movement in regards to housing rights, as well as I know you opened with telling us about how Stalin was like, yo, we're gonna pull up if they keep on messing with African American cotton farmers and everything like that. But like, is there an instance where they've taken an interest in like housing rights and stuff like that, like tenant unions as well, not just labor unions?
Tenant unions, yes, absolutely. That I didn't get into that much, but there is there's a wealth of history there too, where yeah, I mean, especially in New York. So New York City is one of the few places with, some sort of housing. Oh, now I'm on here twice. I'm just gonna. Housing protections built into our Constitution, one of the few places with like rent control laws throughout the country. I know for those of us that live here, they feel inadequate. They are inadequate, but that doesn't mean they're still not better than what most people have around the country. And the reason those are in place is because communists and leftists came together in the 30s to secure, and agitate for these sort of constitutional state level rights. And, communists and workers built, the first public housing and fought for it and demanded it. And they did this through tenant unions.
The first public housing in the States or in the city, in New York City?
In New York City, for sure. But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, tenants organizing has always been an essential part of communist organizing. I mean, basically, it's trying to, the things that are our basic needs that we feel should be guaranteed, that are, I mean, even now, by now the UN says it too, right? Like these are guaranteed human rights. But communists, exactly. But communists were saying that even before it was written down anywhere, right? So
like, I mean, like the UN seemed to
just the mic.
Oh yeah. Like the UN seems to be like that international platform that the Soviet Union used to be in regards to like standing up for individual rights and whatnot. Although, like, of course, the Western media machine has definitely like co-opted a lot of the airtime, but the majority of the people at the United Nations are the global South. Like
exactly. I mean, but this is why the U.S. doesn't recognize international law. Because right.
Yeah. The U.S. actually is a rogue nation in regards to the international criminal court,
right.
In regards to the majority of the laws that the U.S. breaks in around the world, including on American soil as well too. Like, I mean, even though the government doesn't necessarily recognize the International Criminal Court, that doesn't mean an individual can't still take anybody in this country to International Criminal Court.
And you also had, I mean, and the communists have always pushed for this too. You had in the 50s, Paul Robeson and other Black communists called for an intervention by the UN for Black liberation and investigation into the crimes of the U.S. And that's actually why you get a couple years later unanimously decided Brown v. Board of Education. That's why, because there was enough global pressure that the Supreme Court felt that they had to say that, Black people had rights to public education because there was this international communist pressure, and that was led by Black communists in the US. So we're just about to wrap up. I just want to say for next class, we are going to be covering some sort of basic unionization. I also added one more article to if you already had printed out the PDFs like from a couple weeks ago, I added one. There was an article that came out in Bloomberg a couple days ago about salting that I added to the packet that I thought would be a good salt. Well, you'll find out. You'll find out what salting is. If you don't know what it is, you will learn. And we'll talk about that next class. But yeah, the just so you guys know, the final song we're ending on for today, it's called Workers' Song. It's let me get my song packet out so I can send my note about it. So music and lyrics by Ed Pickford, leftist, a lefty musician in the 80s. He wrote it. It was inspired by the sort of meter and style of old time Union songs. And it clearly inspired by Joe Hill. It even references one of his songs. And this version it's by Dropkick Murphys. So enjoy.
Yeah, this one's for the workers who toil night and day, by hand and by brain, to earn your pay, who for centuries on past for no more than your bread, have bled for your countries. crib is shit out for the worker is working when the fat cats above. We're the first ones to start, we're the first ones to die, the first ones in line for that pie in the sky, and we're always the last when the crib is shit out for the worker is working when the fat cat's about. And all these things the worker has done, from tilling the fields to carrying the gun, we've been yoked to the plow since time was begun, and always expected to carry the can.
Thank you, comrades. See you next week. Thank you. See you Thursday.